Hello everyone, my name is Ashish and you're watching another WebGuide YouTube channel. In this video, we are going to learn about the Context API. So without wasting any time, let's get started. If you have not yet subscribed to our channel, please hit the subscribe button and also the notification bell icon so that you don't miss any of our videos. As you can see that we have our VS Code text editor along with the Chrome browser, and I've also set up a basic React project using the Create React app. Now to understand the Context API, we need to understand the purpose of using Context API. If you have seen my last video, you must be familiar about the concept of states and props. The issue with states is that states can only be passed downwards to the children. What I mean is, let me show you this illustration which I have made in Figma. So if we have this app here, and this is a stateful component, suppose. Now if these components want to use this state, they can use it through props. However, if these components want to use this state, it cannot pass this state directly here. It has to lift up the state here, and then we can pass through props. Now it is still easy, but what if the component on a different branch wants to access this state? In that case, there is no mechanism by which we can pass this state to here. For that, we will have to lift this state to the root component, and then we will have to pass this state through props to the component where it is desired. This is often tedious and also undesirable because the state should be managed only in the component which requires or uses it. But here we are unnecessarily passing the state through all these components where it is not required. So in that case, the Context API is very helpful because the Context API gives us a data layer or the provider which contains the global state, and any component which requires the state can access this global state from the provider. Let's see this through the example. One of the most common use case of using the Context API is for storing the user. The user is a component which can be asked anytime by any of the other component. For example, the nav bar may display the user at the end, and the hero section may also display the user saying hello user or something like that. So the user component is something which should be accessible through any component in the app. So let's see how we can create a fake user implementation using the Context API. So to implement the Context API, we require three things. Firstly, we will create the context. Next is we'll create a provider. And third is we'll use the use context hook to use that created context. Let's see how we can do that. First, we'll create a file, say user context.js. Now inside this, we'll say import React from React. Now we'll create the context using the create context function. So we'll say export const user context is equal to create context and function. Inside the parenthesis, we need to pass the initial value of the context. So in case we want to give a default value, then we can pass inside the parenthesis. Right now, I'm leaving it empty. Now, we also need to import this create context from React. So we'll say create context here, like this. And we are using this export keyword because we can only use one default export in the file. Here we need to export two things, the user context and the provider. So that's why we are using the named export. So now after we have created the user context, let's create the provider. So we can say export const user provider. Let's create an arrow function. And inside this, we will say return, and we will return user context dot provider. So we'll say user context dot provider. Now all the component inside this user context.provider will have access to all the information inside this user provider function. So now let's create some information which will pass to the other components. So here we'll say useState. And now we'll create a state user. So we'll say const user, set user is equal to, and we'll say useState. Inside the useState, we have to give the default value, so we can give guest, and later on we'll change it to something else. So now inside the user context.provider, we have to provide a value. First, let's just pass a string. So we'll say this comes from context. Now we have to add some component inside this user context.provider. For that, let's create another component, say navbar. So here we'll go and create another file, say navbar.js. We'll do RAFCE. If you don't know how I'm doing this RAFCE kind of thing, so I have an extension installed which goes ES7 React Redux snippets. You can install that, and then you will be able to do RAFCE for the arrow function, and you will be able to get this kind of boilerplate. So now coming back to the navbar component, inside this let's create a h2. Here we can say this is a navbar. Okay, now we want to use the information, this value, this comes from the context inside this navbar. So for that, we can use the use context. We have created the context. Now we have a provider. We need to use context hook to use it inside the navbar component. So here we'll say react, use context. And inside the navbar function, we'll say const value is equal to use context and inside the use context we need to pass the context, which is the user context. So let's go over it once again. Here we created the user context. After that we created a user provider. Now we are passing this user context to this use context so that we are able to use it. Now we also need to import this user context. So we'll go to the end, we'll do Control plus spacebar and we'll press enter, and you can see that it got imported. So sometimes it works, sometimes it does not, but most of the time you can use it. You can go to the end of this word and you can press Control plus enter, Control plus spacebar, and it should auto import the component. So now let's render the value of the browser. So we'll say h3 here, and here we'll do curly braces, and then inside the curly braces we'll say value, like this. Now let's add this navbar component inside the provider. So inside this user context.provider, we can do navbar like this, and of course you also need to import this navbar. It automatically got imported in my file because I'm using the auto import extension, and if you're not using that, you need to do it manually. Now in the app.js we can use this user provider. So you can see that it is being named export. So we can do a named import here. So we'll say import, we'll say user provider, and we'll say from user context, like this. Now inside this div, we'll say user provider. And here you can see that we have the navbar text and then this value which comes from the context. Now this is the most basic way of using the context API. Let's go over it once again. So we created this user context. After that, we created the user provider. We used the use context hook to extract the information inside the user context. Now, instead of putting the nav bar here, what we can do is we can accept these components as props. So instead of writing nav bar, we can accept this as props here, and here we can say props.children. Props.children like this. And of course, it should be in curly braces like this. Now here we'll go to the app.js, and instead of self-closing it, we have to make it like this. That's it. Now inside this user provider element, we will pass the nav bar component. So we'll say nav bar. And it says nav bar is not defined because we have not imported the nav bar. So we'll do control plus space, and it should auto import, and yes. So now you can see the same result. So you might be thinking, okay, this is fine, but where is our user? So let's see that. Here is our user. So we can pass this to the provider in the same manner we have passed the string. So instead of the string, we will create a curly braces, and inside this we'll pass user and set user. And you can see that our user is being displayed on the browser. This is because we are storing this user in the value, and then we are displaying the value. Now instead of storing this in value, we can use array destructuring to extract the user as well as set user. And if you observe, this is exactly similar to the way we use our states. So you can use the user to just display the user, and we can use the set user to change the information inside this user context. Let's see how to do that. For that, let's create a button component. So here we'll go and create a button component. We'll say button.js, and we'll do RAFCE. And here again, we have to import the use context because we are going to use the context which we had created. So we'll say use context. Now inside this button function, we'll say const user comma set user. This should be in brackets, square brackets. Okay. After that, we'll say equal to use context. Inside the use context, we'll say the context which we have created, that is user context. And you also need to import this user context, which in my case has already been imported. After that, inside this div, we'll create a button, and we'll create a onClick event. We'll say onClick equal to angle brackets, and inside this we'll create an arrow function, and here we'll say set user, and let's give a name, say Ashish. Now in practical application, this name would be coming from an API request or from a database, but in this case we are just hard coding it just to show you what is happening. So here we'll say change name like this. Now we can add this button component inside our app.js file. So here we'll say button like this. We need to import this button element. Okay, that is auto imported. Now if we click on this button component, this guest should change to Ashish, hopefully. Now if we click on this, you can see that it has changed to Ashish. So that is how you change the values inside of this user context. So you can see that we created the context. I'm saying it again and again so that it is imprinted on your mind and you can be very fluent while using the Context API, because the better you will understand Context API, easier it will be for you to learn Redux. So I'll go again. We first created the user context by using the create context function. After that, we created the user provider. Inside the user provider, we created the state or the piece of information which we wanted to pass, and then we did user context.provider. Inside the user context.provider, we pass the attributes value, and in the value we pass the state which we wanted to be available for other components. Now after that, we accepted the children as props, and then in the app component we use the user provider component as the wrapper, and as children we pass navbar and button, which were able to access the information inside the user context by using the use context hook. So in the button component and in the navbar component, we used the use context hook to access the information inside the user context. I hope this video would have helped you to understand the Context API better. In case you learned something, please hit the like button. See you in the next video. Till then, take care. Bye-bye.